Tonight we will delve into a topic that, like a persistent shadow from yesterday, reveals a chilling truth about the way history treated the emotions, fears, and intricate mental health of women. A universe of misunderstanding, misdiagnosis, and what is even darker, unjust punishment awaits our exploration. From the dawn of ancestral medicine to the oppressive atmosphere of Victorian asylums, from the stigma of so-called hysteria to the administration of remedies as unusual as they were dangerous, we will embark on a journey through the centuries. A tour of treatments that, in their time, were considered conventional, but today make our skin crawl with their strangeness and grieve us with their cruelty. So, as you settle in for this nighttime story, I invite you to make a small gesture. If you find value or solace in the stories I share, a like and a subscription would be a kind signal of your company. And, if you wish to share a moment of your present, let me know in the comments what corner of the world you inhabit and what time your clock reads. It is always fascinating to see how this community intertwines from the most diverse points on the planet. Friends of silence and dreams woven into words, let us continue our journey to the misty shores of the past, where the shadows of misunderstanding loom over the female psyche. Today, the first stop of our exploration places us in the cradle of philosophy, ancient Greece, a melting pot of evocative myths and medical theories that today seem, to say the least, singular. Imagine for a moment being a woman in the year 400, before the Common Era. An oppressive sensation nests in your chest. Your heart beats with an inexplicable speed, and at times, a wave of panic floods you for no apparent reason. When you try to describe this discomfort to the local healer, he, after a theatrical stroking of his chin, proclaims with conviction a diagnosis as peculiar as it is unsettling: a wandering uterus. Yes, you heard that correctly. The revered Hippocrates, the one whose legacy endures in the oath that bears his name, firmly held the belief that female uteruses possessed a will of their own, almost capricious. According to his unique theory, if a woman allowed herself to be too emotional, succumbed to anxiety, or even chose a life of celibacy, her uterus could literally pack its belongings and embark on an erratic journey through the body, like a disoriented tourist, ascending towards the chest, descending towards the legs, wandering aimlessly as it pleased. The symptoms that inevitably followed this organic migration, vertigo, difficulty breathing, tremors, were considered the direct consequence of this nomadic organ, causing havoc on its internal pilgrimage. Now, the prescribed treatment was far from what one might expect. No comfort of a warm blanket or the relief of an herbal tea was offered. Instead, physicians would bring pleasantly scented herbs to the pelvic region, while repulsive aromas were offered near the nose in a desperate attempt to lure the uterus back to its original home. Imagine the scene: someone waving burnt garlic under your face, as if trying to evoke the spirit of your own uterus in a kind of anatomical seance. All of it, of course, coated with a patina of scientific rigor. And in a society where women lacked a political voice, the right to own property, and even the freedom to wear pants, this strange diagnosis stood as the only plausible explanation for female discomfort. Anxiety was not conceived as an intrinsic mental or emotional experience, but was reduced to a manifestation of rebellious reproductive behavior. To be fair to the ancient Greeks, they worked with the conceptual tools of their time, without the sophistication of brain scanners, without the understanding of serotonin neurochemistry, without an informed perspective on psychological trauma. But still, to attribute the entirety of female suffering to a misbehaving uterus, the modern analogy would be as absurd as if, upon a car breakdown, the mechanic diagnosed, "Ah yes, the cup holder is wandering again." The inescapable truth is that the women of antiquity experienced profound pain, fear, stress, and uncertainty. But instead of probing their feelings, of offering a space for expression, they were offered incense and assured that their uterus was misaligned. And so began a foreboding silence, not just of misunderstood symptoms, but of stories never heard. Now, our journey takes us to majestic ancient Rome, an empire where civilization advanced by leaps and bounds, hydraulic engineering reached impressive heights, and compassion, let's say, was still in its early stages of construction. If a Roman woman struggled with anxiety, there was no therapist to turn to, no helpline to call, and certainly no effervescent bath bomb to soothe her tensions in the vast thermal baths. Instead, the response she would likely receive would be pragmatic advice, get married or have a child, or ideally, both, with haste. This was because, according to the medical minds of the time, almost exclusively male. Of course, her emotional distress was rooted in an underemployed uterus, idle in its reproductive functions. She was not diagnosed with anxiety. She was attributed with furor uterinus, a term that evokes the image of a fearsome Roman battle formation, but was actually their way of describing female emotional instability. If a woman allowed herself to cry too often, expressed opinions out of turn in conversation, or simply manifested general agitation, she was considered to be failing in her inherent gender duties. The prescribed cure was, to say the least, repetitive, continuous childbirth. A renowned Roman physician, Soranus of Ephesus, who even bequeathed a treatise on gynecology to posterity, strongly recommended that women avoid any kind of intense emotion. In essence, the proposed solution was, simply, to stop feeling. Problem solved, according to his peculiar logic. He also advised husbands to be gentle, which, interpreted in the context of Roman customs, probably meant refraining from shouting during dinner. If a woman of the Roman patrician class showed signs of anxiety, she might be prescribed wine and music, a remedy that wouldn't sound entirely unpleasant, if not for the fact that the underlying diagnosis was still based on the belief that her uterus was functioning poorly, like a broken machine in a bakery. For women of more humble social strata, the remedies were even more direct and often less considerate. Herbal mixtures of dubious efficacy, archaic spiritual rites, or simply being ignored in their suffering. And woe to her who dared to question her husband's authority, failed to offer a complacent smile during dinner, or allowed herself to weep for an extended time after the loss of a pregnancy. Such deviations could earn her the label of unstable, or worse, the accusation of being possessed by evil spirits or under the influence of wrathful deities. Nothing evokes compassionate attention quite like a priest waving chicken bones, while the afflicted woman sobs inconsolably on a cold marble bench. Thus, while Rome bequeathed to us an impressive network of roads, a nascent legal system, and monumental architecture, to the women who battled anxiety, it offered nothing more than shame wrapped in olive leaves. Their pain was medicalized through a distorted lens, moralized with rigid gender expectations, and finally, minimized to the point of invisibility. Because, in the end, no one stopped to ask what they were going through. They only wondered when they were expecting their next child. Let us now enter, with soft and stealthy steps, the shadowy corridors of the Middle Ages, an era where nights stretched out lugubriously, plagues flourished, and if a woman suffered from anxiety, it was most likely interpreted as a disturbing possession, as if Satan himself had rented a dwelling in her troubled soul. Medical understanding, far from advancing, seemed to retreat before the torrent of superstitions and ancestral fears. The Greek ideas about the wandering uterus still persisted, but now seasoned with a generous dose of dread, purifying fire, and sacred panic. Those women who experienced what we now recognize as anxiety, uncontrollable tremors, inconsolable crying, sudden panic attacks, intrusive thoughts that assaulted the mind, were frequently considered spiritually compromised, prey to dark influences. Because, in the relentless logic of the time, if a woman's hands trembled ceaselessly, or if tears streamed down her face in the darkness of the night, it could not be emotional trauma or a mental ailment. They were, without a doubt, demonic manifestations. The Church exercised absolute dominion over the landscape of healing, and that healing often took forms as terrifying as ritual exorcism, public humiliation before the community, or, in the most severe and desperate cases, a funeral pyre with her name engraved in the flames. If a woman dared to admit that she heard whispering voices inside her, or simply displayed behavior that deviated from the norm, she could be accused of witchcraft with chilling ease. Herbal remedies with a suspicious origin, unsettling knowledge about the movement of the stars, a cry that was considered of satanic origin. All of this was interpreted as a clear gateway for evil, in this era of religious fervor and constant fear of the unknown. Anxiety was not only deeply misunderstood, but it was the object of a visceral fear, and that fear, lodged in the body of the wrong woman, could lead to her confinement in a gloomy convent, to being submerged in the cold waters of a river in a desperate attempt to purify her, or to be tried before a tribunal, where the incriminating evidence could include a simple testimony that she seemed strange during Mass. There were certainly monasteries and infirmaries where some nuns, moved by compassion, tried to provide care for women suffering from mental anguish. But without a true understanding of the intricate mechanisms of the human mind, treatment was generally reduced to long and incessant prayers, oppressive isolation, and rigorous fasts. Because, according to the logic of the time, nothing soothed a troubled soul like a dangerously low blood sugar level and a sepulchral silence. And let's not forget the rudimentary diagnostic tools of the era. If a woman's happiness led her to faint or tremble uncontrollably, someone might press a cold cross against her forehead in an attempt to discern if she shuddered at the divine presence. If she did, well, she could say goodbye to her humble possessions and prepare for a close encounter with the town's torchbearer. It is a profound tragedy to contemplate the fate of these women. They were not malevolent witches, nor impenitent sinners, nor unwilling hosts of demonic spirits. They were suffering human beings, people struggling to inhale a breath of air amid oppression, who were trying to fall asleep in the whirlwind of nightly terror. But in a world built on foundations of fear and ignorance, a woman who trembled became a palpable threat, and threats were burned, not understood. Ah, the Renaissance. A beloved age of artistic rebirth, scientific flourishing, and literary effervescence. Everything seemed to be rediscovered with fervor, except, unfortunately, the much-needed compassion for female mental health, which apparently remained forgotten in some dark medieval basement. While Michelangelo chiseled the perfection of David, and Leonardo da Vinci sketched the plans for ingenious helicopters, doctors were still struggling to unravel the mystery of why women experienced feelings. And, surprisingly, the predominant theory was still the same tired, recurring villain, the uterus. While ancient texts resurfaced with renewed interest, they were often filtered through more recent and refined interpretations, an elegant way of saying that female emotions were still blamed for being, inherently, too feminine. Anxiety was the direct consequence of not being married. Panic attacks? The solution was to conceive as soon as possible. Depression? A good session of bloodletting with leeches was urgently needed. Yes, leeches. Or, if you were fortunate enough to belong to a higher social class, cupping, less invasive bloodletting, or a hot poultice applied directly to the abdomen. Doctors truly believed in the need to balance the body's humours, and for women, this invariably meant draining them until their soul quieted down or, at least, until they fainted and stopped expressing their ailments. But the remedies did not end with unpleasant leeches. There were also calming rituals that included confinement in a dark room for endless days, or the medical advice to refrain from reading, as a woman with too many books in her head ran the risk of starting to think for herself. And thinking, of course, was considered a dangerous catalyst for the instability of her delicate uterus. In the homes of the elite, those women who suffered from the nebulous ailments could be sent to the countryside to rest, which sounded idyllic in theory, but often translated into being constantly watched, silenced in their worries, and medicated with herbal tonics of dubious efficacy until they recovered a forced smile, or at least pretended to. The Renaissance loved beauty, celebrated harmony and proportion in all its artistic and philosophical manifestations, but it seemed not to know what to do with a woman who cried uncontrollably or was assaulted by insomnia in the darkness of the night. Emotional pain, especially when it afflicted a woman, was considered untamed, unbalanced, an inconvenience to the social order. Therefore, it was silenced with firmness, covered with expensive silks, locked behind the heavy doors of bedchambers, and dismissed as a simple female problem. And in the great halls where immortal paintings were born and transcendental symphonies were composed, the women who fought against anxiety walked in silence, with their heads bowed and their gazes lost, wondering if perhaps the problem truly resided within them, not the outside world, not the social pressures, not the palpable pain, but themselves. Because even in the effervescent age of the Enlightenment, the fear that gripped a woman was still considered a shameful defect that had to be hidden at all costs, not a deep wound that deserved to be listened to with attention and empathy. As we enter the 17th and 18th centuries, the world is buzzing with the promise of progress. Telescopes scrutinize the depths of the starry skies. Philosophers passionately reflect on the concepts of freedom and reason. And Isaac Newton finally unveils the laws of gravity, providing humanity with a more solid explanation for its own breakdowns. But if you were a woman during the Enlightenment who suffered from the ravages of anxiety, all that rational effervescence seemed to offer little comfort. Because while the world was discovering natural laws and proclaiming the inherent rights of man, your trembling hands and sleepless nights were still condescendingly classified as mere female troubles. The men of medicine, now adorned with powdered wigs and stern countenances, began to write learned treatises on the intricate nervous system. They even coined a term to refer to women like you, nervous ladies. It sounded polite, perhaps even endowed with a certain elegance, but behind that apparently sophisticated label, the same old ingrained belief persisted. Women were emotionally delicate, spiritually fragile, and biologically predisposed to collapse. The uterus, fortunately, had ceased to be the wandering scapegoat, but now doctors pontificated that women suffered from an excess of nerves, an overload of sensory stimulation, and an overflowing imagination. In short, the verdict of the Enlightenment was that women were simply too much. If you cried frequently, felt overwhelmed by daily demands, or experienced sudden panic attacks, the medical prescription might include absolute rest, comforting warm baths, gentle walks in nature, or the star remedy of the era, laudanum, a charming cocktail of alcohol and opium that promised to calm your anxiety, relieve your pain, and possibly slow your pulse to a near standstill. But at least under its effects, you would stop complaining. For women of the more affluent classes, there were nervous retreats, sanctuaries where attentive servants catered to their every need while gently dissuading them from reading, deep reflection, or the discussion of any disturbing topic, including, of course, their own emotions. More humble women, however, did not enjoy the luxury of sedation. They simply had to endure their suffering in silence. And if one dared to express anger, frustration, or, God forbid, ambition, she could be considered not only anxious but unstable, dangerous, even mad. Her own husband had the power to order her confinement without a trial, without the need for explanations. Just a signature was enough to plunge her into forced silence. This was the Enlightenment: reason and public discourse for men, sedation and private silence for women, logic to build imposing libraries, fear to lock doors with a bolt. So while the world reveled in the bright light of discovery and intellectual advancement, women battling anxiety sat silently in the shadows, medicated, misunderstood, and constantly reminded that their pain was nothing more than a fleeting flutter of nerves, a trifle of no importance, nothing to really worry about. Just breathe deeply, and above all, don't think too much. Now we slide gently into the 19th century, the lavish Victorian era, where a veneer of elegance covered the surface of life. Corsets were tightened with rigor, manners became even stricter, and emotional expression, especially in the case of women, was considered frankly a social indecency. Anxiety had not disappeared. It had simply been renamed with a new term, more in keeping with the sensibility of the time. Welcome to the era of the rest cure, developed by Dr. Silas Weir Mitchell, a man with a fine moustache and a questionable empathy, to say the least. The rest cure was prescribed with fervour to women who suffered from what was still broadly labelled as nervous disorders. Did you feel anxious, exhausted, steeped in melancholy? The solution, according to Dr. Mitchell, was as simple as it was drastic. Confine yourself to bed for weeks, even months, without allowing yourself to read, write, receive comforting visits, or even have the chance to verbalize your feelings. Just a luxuriously decorated room, heavy curtains filtering the daylight, the insipid monotony of boiled milk, and the slowly growing corrosive feeling that your sanity was beginning to fade, which, ironically, was a likely consequence of the treatment itself. Women were expected to surrender completely to stillness, to merge into a state of absolute passivity. Any hint of movement was interpreted as rebellion. Independent thought was considered dangerous, a threat to their recovery. If a patient dared to resist this forced confinement, she was said to be resisting the cure itself, which conveniently justified a prolongation of the confinement. This was not a marginal treatment or practiced in secret. It enjoyed widespread respect in the medical circles of the time. The celebrated writer Charlotte Perkins Gilman was subjected to the rest cure, an experience she later captured in her chilling story The Yellow Wallpaper, a vivid narration of a woman driven to the brink of madness by her imposed silence. Spoiler alert. It was not the wallpaper design that broke her, but the invisible cage of polite, padded negligence in which she was enclosed. And then there were the asylums, somber buildings that rose like monuments to misunderstanding. If a woman's anxiety did not respond to the monotonous diet of milk and mandatory naps, it was very likely she would end up behind the cold stone walls of a sanatorium. Once inside, patients were subjected to treatments as brutal as ice baths, the indiscriminate application of electrotherapy, and constant, dehumanizing observation. Some were given morphine to silence their suffering. Others were immobilized for days. Their only crime, crying too intensely, speaking with an unacceptable speed, refusing to show a forced smile. And once again, no one stopped to ask the reason for their anguish. No one inquired if they had lost a child, if they had been victims of domestic violence, or if they had simply broken under the unbearable weight of the expectations of female perfection imposed by society. In the Victorian world, women were supposed to be calm, serene beings, almost angelic in their composure, and if they were not, they were hidden from public view, beautifully, silently, tragically, because the social structure was not designed to treat anxious women, but to prevent them from interrupting the harmonious and superficial peace of the family dinner table. Welcome to the dawn of the 20th century, an era where corsets were beginning to loosen, the industrial age was humming with unprecedented energy. And a man named Sigmund Freud had taken up the peculiar hobby of attributing almost all psychic ailments to early childhood or the father figure. Freud, the father of psychoanalysis, offered an idea that, at the time, was considered revolutionary. Perhaps women were not possessed by demons or suffering from the dysfunction of a capricious uterus. Perhaps the root of their suffering lay in their own mind, in the depths of their unconscious, in their repressed desires and unresolved internal conflicts. This, in theory, should have marked a transcendental turning point, a moment of genuine progress in the understanding of the female psyche. And, in a way, it was. Instead of immersing anxious women in icy water or feeding them opium to silence their complaints, doctors now invited them to lie on a padded couch and speak freely. Revolutionary, indeed. But before we pop the champagne of celebration, let's pause for a moment to analyze how that free expression was expected to unfold. Freud and his followers often interpreted female anxiety as the direct result of repressed sexual desire or internalized guilt, usually directed towards their parental figures. If a woman suffered from anxiety, it was very likely that she was repressing something scandalous, something that not even she herself consciously recognized. Did she feel a paralyzing fear of leaving her home, clearly a symbol of something deeper? Did she suffer from recurring nightmares? Probably a complex metaphor related to her mother. Did she experience panic attacks? Definitely something of Freudian origin, perhaps with hidden phallic connotations. And while this new method of treatment was undoubtedly less violent in its physical application than previous ones, it still carried its own subtle and pernicious form of blame. The problem invariably resided within the patient herself. Not in her life circumstances, not in the trauma she experienced, not in the suffocating expectations imposed on her shoulders. She simply needed to unpack her unconscious. And if she did not experience a significant improvement, the blame fell back on her. Perhaps she was not trying hard enough in her introspection. Perhaps she was resisting confronting the hidden truth in the shadows of her mind. Psychoanalysis spread like wildfire among the intellectual elite of the time. In Viennese rooms saturated with tobacco smoke, doctors scribbled notes frantically while women whispered their deepest dreams and fears, still struggling to be taken seriously, still yearning to be heard with true empathy. It was a step forward, yes, but a fragile progress, tinged with a masculine perspective, because although the physical cages had been replaced by comfortable couches, female anxiety continued to be interpreted through a male lens, often reduced to repressed libido, unsatisfied longing, or persistent paternal conflicts. And so, the fundamental question remained without a clear answer. Could a woman simply be anxious, without being immediately catalogued as broken or dysfunctional? Or would every tremor, every silent tear, every stifled scream invariably be attributed to a psychoanalytic theory, instead of being recognized as a palpable truth of her experience? Now, we find ourselves in the 1950 seconds. The war is over. The promise of suburban life spreads out like a green carpet, and your exquisite casserole is expected to be steaming on the table at exactly 6 in the evening. You are the perfect suburban woman. Impeccable nails, a bright smile, a pearl necklace around your neck, and your anxiety? Well, dear, that's simply not something one talks about out loud, because, according to the glossy covers of women's magazines and the optimistic airwaves of daytime radio, everything in this new world is perfect. So why do you feel that stabbing need to scream into the void? Enter Mother's Little Helper, the eloquent nickname for a small pill with an immense promise, calm personified in Valium and its predecessor, Miltown. These small sedatives were marketed directly to women, especially to housewives who felt overwhelmed by the undervalued responsibilities of their silent labor or who were slowly crumbling in a sea of perfectly coordinated Tupperware containers. Feeling sad, anxious, apathetic, just take one of these wonderful pills, dear, and offer a radiant smile to the neighbors. Doctors distributed them with an alarming lightness, as if they were harmless candies. No one stopped to inquire about possible hidden traumas. No one asked about the profound loneliness that could overwhelm these women. No one questioned whether spending every day vacuuming carpets in high heels while feigning an unattainable perfection could ultimately be crushing to the spirit. Because in this new world of social conformity and unbridled consumerism, the ideal role of a woman was to be perpetually happy and content. And if she wasn't, it was clear that something was fundamentally wrong with her. Not with the role assigned to her, not with the suffocating expectations that weighed on her shoulders, not in the endless isolation of domestic life. The pharmaceutical companies adhered to this narrative with a disturbing enthusiasm. An advertisement for tranquilizers showed a woman desperately clinging to the sink, accompanied by the unsettling caption, "You can't free her, but you can help her feel less trapped." Another proudly promised an artificial peace of mind for overworked housewives. Those who held the family together with a forced smile and a growing dose of benzodiazepines. By the 1,960 seconds, millions of women were medicated, not necessarily because they suffered from a diagnosable mental illness, but because they were exhausted to the core, because they felt deeply sad without understanding why, because they were human beings trapped in a culture that did not allow them to be fully so. And while these drugs offered short-term symptomatic relief, they often came with a long-term dependency, a silent shadow that loomed over their lives. But no one talked about it openly. Addiction, after all, was considered unladylike, so they smiled for the outside world. They swallowed their little pills of artificial happiness. And somewhere deep inside, under the chemical sedation, the real question persisted, unalterable. What if her anxiety was not just a psychiatric disorder? What if it was actually an urgent warning? A silent scream from a soul that had never been allowed to raise its voice. In the 1,970 seconds, a subtle but transcendental change began to stir in the air. The casserole still steamed fragrantly on the table. The home remained immaculately tidy, reflecting the imposed neatness. But now, the woman who inhabited that domestic space began to ask questions that resonated with a new force. Why am I the only one who turns to sedation for relief? Why does my pain receive a prescription, but the need for a deep conversation is silenced? And who decided that anxiety was something I should apologize for, something I should hide in shame? The feminist movement, far from manifesting with blind fury, grew driven by an incisive clarity. Women from various walks of life began to gather in consciousness, raising groups, in the intimacy of living rooms, and on bustling university campuses. They shared their experiences, compared their lives, and the discovery that emerged from these intimate conversations was revealing. They were not alone in their suffering. Slowly, they began to understand that anxiety was not an inherent personal defect, an individual flaw. It was not simply about hormonal imbalances or the mysterious hysteria that had haunted women for centuries. Often, anxiety was the logical and predictable consequence of an existence marked by overwork, a systematic lack of recognition, and the tacit expectation of performing strenuous, invisible, emotional labor, as if it were just another piece of domestic furniture. Books like The Feminine Mystique by Betty Friedan broke through the neat surface of post-war domesticity, revealing a deep unease, the problem that has no name. Friedan described women who, despite having everything society had taught them, they should desire the perfect home, the provider husband, healthy children, felt inexplicably empty, anxious, restless, trapped in an existence that did not allow them to fully flourish. Finally, someone dared to verbalize the silenced truth. It's not in your head. It's in the walls that confine you, in the suffocating expectations, in the oppressive silence that surrounds you. And once that ancestral silence was broken, there was no turning back. Women began to reclaim ownership of their own narratives. They stopped accepting tranquilizers as a convenient excuse for their feelings. They began to question the medical and social institutions that had pathologized their emotions for centuries, reducing them to mere biological imbalances or feminine whims. In therapy rooms, a new type of counselor emerged, a professional willing to listen with true attention, without ingrained prejudices, a therapist who did not automatically assume that every panic attack was a desperate cry for marriage or motherhood. Women began to enter the fields of psychology, medicine, and psychiatry, not just as vulnerable patients, but as trained professionals, bringing a long-ignored perspective. It was not a perfect process. Misdiagnosis was still a palpable reality. Gender bias still persisted in many areas, and pharmaceutical companies continued their lucrative business. But something fundamental had changed in the dynamic of the conversation. Women were speaking, and this time, their voices were not systematically interrupted or dismissed. They were connecting the dots, tracing the intricate lines that linked their personal pain with omnipresent social pressures, their internal struggle with the external structures that shaped their lives. They were rewriting the imposed narrative, transforming the question, "What's wrong with me?" into a deeper, more revealing inquiry. What has happened to me? And slowly, painfully, the world began to change its perspective. Because when women stopped whispering their fears in the dark and started sharing their experiences, they discovered a revolutionary truth, that their anxiety was not a manifestation of madness or inherent weakness, but a genuine response, a logical consequence of trying to find an authentic voice in a world that, for too long, had refused to listen. As the 1,980 seconds and 1,990 seconds progressed, female anxiety finally began to receive a proper nomenclature, stripped of ancestral stigmas. It was no longer hysteria, nor nerves, nor a simple "she's tired." Instead, it was articulated through real and specific diagnostic terms: generalized anxiety disorder, panic disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder. At last, a medical vocabulary that did not blame the uterus for the complexity of the female emotional experience. Progress, right? Well, more or less. Psychiatry was becoming more precise in its categorization. The DSM, the extensive diagnostic manual that catalogued all mental health labels, grew thicker and more detailed, and insurance companies began, albeit reluctantly, to reimburse some treatments. But even as science evolved and refined its understanding, the experience of being a woman suffering from anxiety still came with familiar echoes of doubt, dismissal, and a persistent social stigma. Let's say you were a woman in 1993 who suffered from terrifying panic attacks. You went to a doctor, your heart pounding in your chest, palms sweating, with a visceral fear of dying. He might hand you a generic informational pamphlet, a prescription for an anxiolytic like Xanax, and a polite suggestion that you try to get some more rest. At least medicine had stopped blaming your wandering uterus. Now, the blame frequently fell on your lifestyle. You're working too hard. You're probably just overwhelmed by stress. Have you tried jogging? And yes, therapy had become a real option for those who could afford it financially. But finding a therapist who didn't automatically assume your anxiety was simply a manifestation of being too emotional could still be a considerable challenge. If you allowed yourself to cry in the session, you were labeled as fragile and unstable. If, on the contrary, you suppressed your tears, perhaps you were in a state of denial. Either way, your diagnosis often came with an invisible asterisk, a subtle insinuation that your experience was not entirely valid or complete. Still, for many women, the simple act of finally having a recognized name for what they had been feeling for so long was like receiving a long-awaited mirror after years of living in darkness. It was not a sign of personal weakness. It was not an individual failure. It was something real, tangible, and it had been there all along. Though silenced and misunderstood, medications also underwent a significant evolution. SSRIs, drugs like Prozac and Zoloft, became household names, marketed as modern solutions for modern emotional struggles. And for many people, they really did offer welcome relief. But once again, they were often prescribed without a thorough exploration of the patient's personal history. No one delved into the history of trauma, into generational patterns of anxiety, or into complex family dynamics. The directive was simply offered, take this and you'll feel better. So yes, undeniable progress was made, but it was clinical progress, often devoid of true human compassion and sensitivity. Structured and protocolized, but not always adapted to the uniqueness of each individual experience. The diagnostic labels were new, but the feeling of loneliness that accompanied anxiety remained painfully familiar. Because even with precise names, colored pills, and informational brochures, the fundamental question still lingered in the silence of the troubled mind. Will anyone ever stop to ask why I'm so afraid? Welcome to the first decade of the 21st century, an era where flip phones were the height of technology and low-rise pants generated stylistic confusion. For the first time in centuries of misunderstanding, people began to ask, not just, what's wrong with you, but a much deeper and more revealing inquiry. What has happened to you? It was a quiet revolution, not one marked by banners and mass protests, but by consciousness, raising TED Talks, by personal memoirs that broke the silence, and by clinical conversations that slowly but firmly began to change the perspective. Researchers, therapists, and trauma survivors began to connect dots that for too long had been conveniently ignored. Anxiety was no longer seen simply as a random chemical imbalance or an inexplicable individual quirk. In many cases, it was recognized as a perfectly normal and adaptive response to a life that had not always been kind or fair. And suddenly, three powerful words burst into the center of attention: trauma-informed care. Instead of treating anxiety as an individual flaw to be corrected with medication or superficial behavioral therapy, this innovative approach posed much broader and more significant questions. What early experiences shaped your nervous system so profoundly? What patterns of behavior is your body desperately trying to survive? And what if your state of constant hypervigilance is not a pathological irrationality, but a learned response to an environment perceived as threatening? This was not just an abstract academic debate. It resonated deeply on a personal level, especially for women, because now, anxiety could be traced back to experiences that no one wanted to talk about openly: physical and emotional abuse, childhood neglect, the relentless generational pressure to conform to predefined roles, silenced workplace harassment, the exhausting emotional weight of feigning an unattainable perfection while the inner world crumbled in silence. For many women, this new approach brought immense relief, a profound sense of long-denied validation. For the first time, their fear was not a shameful defect to be hidden, but a real wound, an emotional scar from painful experiences. And wounds, with the right care and understanding, have the potential to heal. But this newfound awareness did not translate into an instant panacea. Society still revered productivity over serenity. Women continued to face the relentless pressure to be calm, competent, and serene, even as they juggled homes, professional careers, child-rearing, and the growing avalanche of mental health buzzwords: burnout, imposter syndrome, high-functioning anxiety, labels that sounded novel but often evoked ancestral feelings. And while therapy became more accessible for some, it remained a costly luxury, with inconsistent results and an unequal distribution. One therapist could offer a safe and empathetic refuge, while another might dispense unsolicited advice and an uncomfortable smile. Social media, that double-edged sword of the modern era, offered both solace and harm. Women could now publicly share their struggles, weaving a web of solidarity that transcended geographical borders and time zones. However, they could also encounter simplistic responses, suggesting they drink more water and meditate as a solution to years of ingrained systemic trauma. Still, a significant shift was taking place, because the world was finally beginning to understand a truth that women had always known intuitively: that anxiety was not a manifestation of personal weakness, but the voice of history whispering through the body, waiting patiently for someone, anyone, to stop and listen. Now we enter the era of ubiquitous Wi-Fi, social media wellness gurus, and smartphones that never grant us a moment's rest. Welcome to the digital age, where female anxiety no longer requires a doctor's diagnosis. A simple screen is enough to trigger it. We wake up to a cascade of notifications: 37 messages, 4 emails, 2 calendar alerts, and a message from someone who just wants to take up your valuable time. We haven't even had our first cup of coffee, but our pulse has already accelerated to a frantic pace. Anxiety in the digital age is not merely an internal state. It is interactive, constant, and omnipresent. We are expected to be permanently available, receptive to external demands, successful in our ventures, perfectly hydrated, emotionally balanced, and preferably radiating a carefully constructed happiness. All this while maintaining a strategically selected smile on a platform that paradoxically calls itself social. The modern woman not only manages her daily life, but is also forced to manage her personal brand in the relentless virtual showcase. And in a paradoxical way, anxiety has become both an alarm signal and a peculiar digital aesthetic. Now, posts that read "My anxiety is particularly intense today" can become a viral trend, as long as they are cleverly combined with the right filter and a caption that denotes self-awareness without falling into excessive emotional effusion. Vulnerability sells, but only if it is presented in an easily digestible and aestheticized way. And if you try to disconnect from this digital whirlwind, good luck. the world doesn't stop to wait for you. The relentless algorithm punishes you with less visibility. Emails pile up in your inbox like a silent mountain of guilt. Even the ancient practice of meditation has been transformed into a performative art, meticulously tracked by an app and graded by the relentless surveillance of your smartwatch. Anxiety seems omnipresent in this new digital landscape, but so are simplistic and often ineffective pieces of advice. You can scroll endlessly through short videos that promise to cure your nervous system in less than 30 seconds. Mindful breathing exercises, the matcha panacea, the practice of journaling, the tapping technique, all potentially valuable tools until they become another box to check on an already overwhelming to-do list. And through all this digital cacophony, the fundamental root of female anxiety remains surprisingly constant: the incessant pressure, the pressure to please others, to achieve professional success, to stay perpetually informed, to be constantly receptive to others' demands, to cultivate an image of impeccable health and wellness, to maintain a slender figure, to be ethically irreproachable, kindly helpful, efficiently productive, creatively innovative, fun, and entertaining, but without overdoing the exuberance. And of course, don't forget to respond immediately to your boss, your best friend, and that group chat of mothers that somehow mysteriously seems to never sleep. It's no wonder you feel that tightness in your chest, because in this era of being online 24/7, the simple act of resting is perceived as radical. Silence becomes suspicious, and the search for inner peace becomes a full-time job in itself. But here is a silent truth, a revelation that whispers in the interstices of the digital noise. Your anxiety is not a programming error, but an unequivocal signal. It is the manifestation that your nervous system was not designed to withstand such sensory and emotional overload. After centuries of being silenced, sedated, shamed, and pushed to physical and mental exhaustion, something unexpected is beginning to happen. Women are slowing their frantic pace, not because the world has loosened its relentless grip, because it has not, but because many are coming to the painful realization that running tirelessly to meet impossible standards only leads to an inevitable destination: absolute burnout, seasoned with a dose of existential angst. So now, in the quiet corners of the internet and in the intimacy of living rooms, in serene yoga studios, and in therapy circles that offer a safe space, a gentle revolution is underway. It is not a loud or viral revolution. It does not manifest in matching sportswear or, quote, ephemeral productivity gurus. It is simply about resting. Rest as a form of silent resistance. Rest as an essential act of recovery. Rest as the long-forbidden medicine that women were denied for centuries. Not the kind of forced rest prescribed by Victorian doctors, but consciously chosen rest. The kind of rest that firmly proclaims, "I owe my exhaustion to no one." Women are learning the transformative power of saying no, not as an admission of failure, but as the establishment of a healthy boundary. They are cancelling plans without remorse, logging off their digital devices, leaving the dirty dishes in the sink without feeling the urge for immediate perfection. And surprisingly, the world continues to turn without stopping. It is not an easy path. Ancestral guilt still lurks in the margins of consciousness, insidiously whispering, "You should be doing more." But now another voice rises alongside it, a softer but equally powerful voice. "You have done enough for today." Breathe deeply. Communities are forming around this fundamental truth. Groups of women who support each other without judgment, who offer an empathetic "me too" instead of a "why can't you just get on with it?" They are rewriting the imposed narrative, one conscious exhale at a time. They are learning that healing does not follow a linear trajectory, that some days they will have the energy to meditate, journal, and walk in the sun. Other days, they will allow themselves to cry over their morning cereal bowl and delete commitments from their calendar without feeling the need to justify themselves. Both realities are valid. And maybe, just maybe, anxiety does not mean you are irreparably broken. Maybe it means you are profoundly awake in a world that strives so hard to numb your sensitivity. So tonight, if your mind is racing with restless thoughts, or if your heart is heavy with an invisible burden, remember this: you are not a machine. You were never designed to be. And in a culture that venerates constant hustle and unbridled productivity, choosing to truly rest is not a sign of weakness, but a manifestation of sacred, ancient, and profoundly revolutionary wisdom. Long before the proliferation of carefully filtered selfies, the fleeting fashion of sailor sleeves, or the regrettable tribal tattoos on the lower back, people were already adorning their skin with indelible ink. In fact, the oldest known tattoos did not belong to rebellious teenagers or battle-hardened warriors. They belonged to a man literally frozen in time. Ötzi the Iceman, discovered high in the Alps in 1991, is over 5,000 years old, his body preserved by the eternal snow, the relentless passage of time, and a stroke of archaeological fortune. He is etched with 61 tattoos, consisting of simple black lines and geometric crosses. No threatening skulls, no mythical dragons, just simple lines. But here lies the fascinating question. These lines were not arranged haphazardly on his skin. They were strategically located on his joints, along his spine, and around his ankles. Modern researchers believe these tattoos may have represented an early form of acupuncture or an ancestral method for relieving chronic pain. An ancient fusion of empirical medicine and magical ritual, engraved on the skin with soot and sharp tools. Primitive in its execution, yes, but also profoundly intentional in its purpose. These were not tattoos intended for aesthetic display. They were tattoos engraved for survival. Ötzi, the Iceman, was not an isolated exception. Throughout ancient Egypt, tattooed mummies have been discovered, predominantly female, adorned with intricate patterns of dots and lines on their bodies. Some archaeologists suggest these tattoos were symbols of fertility, used to invoke the protection of both mother and child during the long process of childbirth. Others interpret them as signs of deep devotion to the powerful goddess Hathor. In any case, their function transcended mere ornamentation. They were spiritual expressions, protective amulets, worn with pride even beyond the confines of earthly life. In the frigid tombs of Siberia, tattooed Scythian nobles were buried with their bodies decorated with stylized representations of mythical animals, majestic deer, agile panthers, imposing griffins, intertwining in bold black ink along their arms and torsos. For these warrior cultures, tattoos were the distinctive mark of a brave warrior, a symbolic passport to the afterlife, and perhaps an indication of their social status within the tribe. These tattooed individuals were not the first human beings to adorn their skin in this way. They were simply the first whose tattooed bodies we have had the fortune to find and study. And this is the silent truth that underlies the history of the tattoo. It did not begin with contemporary pop culture or passing fads. It began with ancestral ritual, with physical pain as an act of transcendence, with a deep intention imbued in every stroke of ink. Tattoos were never merely a form of superficial beauty. They were primitive medicine, a living record of collective memory, a protective shield against visible and invisible evils. Long before ink became a symbol of youthful rebellion, it was a manifestation of reverence, a sacred thread that wove its way through the skin, to tell stories when books did not yet exist, to mark transcendent meaning before we had precise names for the things that surrounded and defined us. So the next time you observe a simple line of ink etched on the skin, remember that someone, thousands of years ago, traced that same line with fire and ash. And that for that person, that simple mark meant everything. To unravel the ancestral essence of the tattoo, we must cross vast oceans and direct our gaze towards the scattered islands of Polynesia, where ink was not a passing fashion but a transcendental ceremony. In places like Samoa, Tonga, and Tahiti, tattoos were not chosen on a momentary impulse or an aesthetic whim. They were considered sacred, earned with effort, and worn with pride throughout one's entire existence. The very word tattoo has its roots in the Polynesian term tatau, which evokes the action of striking, an onomatopoeia of the rhythmic sound produced by the tapping of ink into the skin, using tools meticulously carved from bone. This was not a simple machine, it was an ancestral pulse. The tatau transcended mere bodily ornamentation. It constituted a fundamental rite of passage, often painful in its execution, but always imbued with a profound cultural and spiritual meaning. A young Samoan man would lie on a woven mat, while the tattoo artist, the tufuga, worked diligently for days, sometimes even entire weeks, tapping intricate geometric patterns onto his body with sharpened bone tools and soot. The elaborate design extended from his waist to his knees, a visible symbol of his transition to adulthood, the affirmation of his identity within the community, and the demonstration of his courage in the face of life's challenges. The pain inflicted was not a mere side effect of the process, but an integral part of the ritual itself. To endure it with stoicism was irrefutable proof that the young man was prepared to assume the responsibilities of adulthood. To withdraw halfway through the process not only brought shame to the individual but also dishonored his entire family. In the culture of Tahiti, tattoos acted as visual records of ancestral genealogies, and markers of social status within the tribal hierarchy. They could invoke divine protection, a deep spiritual connection with ancestors and gods, or even indicate sexual maturity and readiness for marriage. A woman's fingers might be delicately tattooed to signal her eligibility for marriage. A man's chest could narrate his warrior lineage and his feats in battle. Every meticulously engraved dot, every precise line, every elegant curve, all possessed a sacred and profound meaning. Even today, in many Polynesian communities scattered across the vast Pacific Ocean, tattoos retain this powerful cultural role. They are not mere expressions of individuality, but tangible bonds that unite present generations with their ancestors, living records worn with pride on the skin, a human scroll that narrates the history of a lineage. When adventurous Europeans first arrived on the Pacific shores during the 18th century, they were simultaneously fascinated and horrified by the cultural practices they witnessed. Sailors like the celebrated Captain Cook left detailed records of this custom in their travel journals. Shortly after, their own crews began to adopt tattoos, not with the intention of honoring the profound ritual meaning they held for the Polynesians, but as a way of marking their exotic journeys, a tangible souvenir of distant lands, a trend stripped of its sacred essence, but engraved on the skin nonetheless. Still, the undeniable origin of the modern tattoo remained unequivocally Polynesian. The tattoo was never conceived as something casual or trivial, but as a sacred, deeply personal practice, carried with pride through the generations, as irrefutable proof that each individual's story was worthy of enduring the pain of its inscription and permanent enough to live just beneath the surface of the skin. As our historical exploration moves eastward, the narrative of the tattoo takes on a more intricate and complex form, a story intertwined with beauty and punishment, honor and shame, all indelibly etched into human flesh. In ancient China, tattoos carried a heavy social stigma. Instead of being revered as symbols of spirituality or strength, they were often infamous marks of disgrace and exclusion. Criminals were tattooed on the face or neck with characters denoting their crimes, such as thief or traitor, permanent reminders to society of their transgressions and of the identity from which they could never escape. This practice was known as sicking, marking the individual for social exile. The punishment imposed did not end with the completion of the legal sentence. It remained visible on their skin for their entire life. However, even in these shadows of imposed shame, the tattoo possessed deeper and more nuanced layers of meaning. Some Chinese warriors, moved by loyalty and honor, voluntarily wore ink on their bodies to demonstrate their fidelity to their brothers in arms or their unwavering devotion to a noble cause. In the legendary novel Water Margin, one of the 108 heroic outlaws is described with his entire body intricately tattooed, with images of majestic dragons, fierce tigers, and dancing flames. A man's honor written on his skin like a sacred and indelible scripture. In Japan, the history of the tattoo is equally stratified, perhaps even more complex in its multiple meanings. The earliest Japanese tattoos, known as irazumi, were used for various purposes: to ward off evil spirits lurking in the darkness, to invoke the protection of fishermen who braved the dangerous depths of the ocean, or even to symbolize social status within the community. But just as in China, tattoos also became tools of punishment imposed by the authorities. Criminals were marked with distinctive lines on their arms, or with specific symbols engraved on their foreheads. In some regions, each new crime committed added another stroke to the infamous mark, a visible count for all of their growing dishonor. But over time, something remarkable began to change in the perception of the tattoo in Japan. During the Edo period, from roughly 1600 to 1800, elaborate full-body tattoos began to emerge as a vibrant, underground art form. Intricate designs depicting serpentine dragons, brightly colored koi carp, revered deities, and fearsome demons began to spread across the backs, arms, and legs of common people. These were not the stigmas of criminals. They were the proud marks of brave firefighters, hard-working laborers, and gamblers of often dangerous reputations. And then arose the Yakuza, the feared organized crime syndicates of Japan, who adopted full-body irazumi as powerful symbols of unwavering strength, sworn loyalty, and fearlessness in the face of danger. The more extensive the tattoo, the greater the respect earned, and the greater the pain endured during its arduous execution. These were not tattoos meant to be displayed in public. They were private, jealously hidden under layers of clothing, revealed only in the intimacy of public bathhouses or in the fury of combat. In both China and Japan, tattoos lived in a constant dialectical tension, oscillating between artistic expression and social punishment, between the affirmation of identity and the stigma of exile, a perpetual dance between personal pride and imposed shame, because sometimes the ink that marks you forever also ends up defining you in an unexpected way. In ancient Europe, tattoos walked a thin dividing line between power and punishment, depending entirely on who wielded the sharp needle and who bore the indelible mark. Let us begin our journey through the lands of the Celts and the Picts, tribal peoples who inhabited what we now know as Great Britain and Scotland. When the battle-hardened Roman soldiers first encountered these warriors, they were stunned by what they witnessed. These men, some completely naked, others covered in wolfskins, were completely covered in intricate dark blue tattoos, fierce spirals and complex knots etched on their faces and bodies. The dye used was a plant-based ink that turned the skin a deep blue, evoking the image of dark storm clouds swirling on living flesh. These were not mere superficial decorations. They were a form of psychological battle armor, a tool of visual intimidation, a bold declaration of tribal identity. To tattoo the body was to proclaim without words, "I do not fear spilling my blood in combat." The great Julius Caesar himself described it in his writings with a mixture of awe and horror, cataloguing them as savages and barbarians, which is ironic considering the practices that Rome would later adopt, because while the Romans prided themselves on their system of laws and social order, they also used tattoos not as symbols of honor or belonging, but as brutal tools of control and subjugation. Convicted criminals, unfortunate slaves, and captured prisoners of war were branded with tattoos that denoted their ownership or their shame before society. A runaway slave could be branded with the letters FVG, short for fugitivus. A soldier who deserted his glorious legion was marked forever with the stigma of dishonor. Even the early Roman Christians, during the turbulent beginnings of the empire, were sometimes tattooed to identify them as enemies of the state, or worse, as dangerous heretics. These were not badges of pride, but heavy burdens they had to bear for their entire existence. However, not all Roman tattoos were imposed as punishment. Some soldiers, particularly those stationed in the eastern provinces of the vast empire, began to voluntarily tattoo themselves with symbols of unwavering loyalty to their legion or expressions of deep devotion to one of their protective deities, a silent form of personal rebellion inked under their hard armor. Over time, as Christianity spread throughout Europe and consolidated its hegemonic power, tattooing fell even further into social disrepute. In the early Middle Ages, it was widely condemned as a pagan, sinful, and barbaric practice. The human body began to be venerated as a sacred temple, and apparently, temples were considered purer and more appropriate without pagan adornments. But deep in the ancestral forests and along the misty, desolate moors, the old tribal traditions secretly endured, whispered through generations, carefully passed down from mother to daughter, from warrior to warrior, because long before ink was associated with criminality, it was a powerful marker of tribal belonging. And on the blood-soaked soils of ancient Europe, the tattoo was the tangible proof that one belonged to their people, to their ancestral land, to their revered gods. As Europe entered the extensive period of the Middle Ages, the tattoo faded from public attention, but it never disappeared completely. It simply submerged into the clandestine, surviving in the shadows of the dominant culture. The Christian Church, which now wielded hegemonic power over the entire continent, strongly condemned the practice of tattooing. It was decreed that the body should remain immaculate, without any blemish, a pure vessel of divine sanctity. Ancient pagan customs, including bodily ornamentation with ink, were relegated, labelled as vestiges of an idolatrous past, acts of rebellion against ecclesiastical authority, or worse, demonic manifestations. And yet, even in this era of severe religious suppression, ink still found its way under the skin of some. Among Christian pilgrims, especially those who undertook the dangerous and arduous journey to the Holy Land of Jerusalem, tattoos transformed into powerful symbols of devotion and unwavering faith. A small cross discreetly tattooed on the wrist or forearm served as a silent but eloquent proof. I made it. You had survived the dangerous seas, the aridity of the deserts, the ambushes of bandits, and you had returned home indelibly marked by your faith. Some pilgrims even received these tattoos while they were in the Holy Land, engraved by Coptic Christian families who had preserved this sacred art for generations, passing it down from father to son as a spiritual legacy. These tattoos were not mere superficial adornments, they were considered tacit spiritual contracts, reminders etched into one's own flesh that proclaimed, "I belong, I have visited his holy city." In some monasteries secluded from the world, tattoos were used as a discreet means to identify members of certain religious orders, symbols hidden from the eyes of the outside world, discreet in their design, but profound in their meaning and internal purpose. There are historical whispers, though rarely confirmed by reliable documentation, about crusader knights who tattooed sacred relics, images of venerated saints, or biblical words on their arms and chests, before departing for battle in distant lands. If they met their death far from home, at least their body would carry with it the indelible mark of heaven. Meanwhile, outside the imposing walls of churches and monasteries, ancient folk traditions stubbornly persisted. In remote villages and in the depths of wooded regions, old pagan customs refused to disappear completely. Women tattooed protective symbols on their hands during the vulnerable trance of childbirth, invoking ancestral forces to ensure a safe birth. Shepherds engraved sacred patterns on their bodies as a pigmented incantation to ward off hungry wolves that stalked their flocks. These were not fashion statements or personal vanity. They were silent prayers inscribed on the skin with natural pigments. But still, to wear tattoos in medieval Europe meant to exist on the margins of society, to be the object of spiritual suspicion and constant social scrutiny, unless, of course, one was marked by force. Criminals, prisoners of war, slaves, all could be tattooed against their will, and in those somber cases, the tattoo was not a personal choice but a visible sentence, a mark of infamy imposed by authority. Thus, the Middle Ages became an intriguing paradox in the history of the tattoo, an era in which ink was simultaneously forbidden and venerated, sacred in some contexts, and a cause for shame in others. An era in which tattoos were not loud displays of individuality, but silent whispers of faith, of subversive defiance, of the enduring human need to leave an indelible mark, even when the dominant world dictated otherwise. As the sails of European ships began to cross the vast oceans during the 16th and 17th centuries, tattoos returned to the Western world, not through the channels of science or the influence of religion, but through the salty roots and maritime superstitions. Bold explorers like Captain James Cook not only mapped unexplored coastlines but also encountered cultures where the art of tattooing was revered as a sacred practice, particularly on the scattered islands of Polynesia. The sailors of Cook's crew, fascinated by the bold visual patterns and the profound cultural meanings inherent in Polynesian tattoos, began to get tattooed themselves. It was something exotic, dangerous, and subversively rebellious, precisely everything a sailor craved in the monotonous routine aboard a ship. From this point of cultural contact, the practice of tattooing spread rapidly through seaports like rum spilled in a tavern. Sailors began to forge their own tattoo culture, a peculiar mix of superstition for survival at sea, maritime traditions passed down through generations, and a way of bragging about their experiences and travels. A ship's anchor tattooed on the forearm meant the sailor had crossed the Atlantic. A turtle etched on the skin indicated he had crossed the equator, officially making him a shellback, a veteran of the tropical seas. A pig and a rooster tattooed on the feet were considered an amulet to protect against drowning in case of a shipwreck, based on the curious observation that these animals were often the only survivors of maritime disasters, floating safely in their wooden crates. Each sailor's tattoo held a specific meaning, although these meanings often changed with the unpredictable ocean tides and the local customs of each port. The image of a dagger piercing a heart could symbolize a lost love in a distant port, or simply evoke the memory of a turbulent night in a Caribbean tavern. The phrase, "hold fast," tattooed on the knuckles, was not a prayer for life in general, but a plea for a firm grip on the wet rigging during violent storms at sea. The tattoo thus became an unofficial language shared among sailors of all nationalities, regardless of their flag, their mother tongue, or their luck with the rum ration. The ink on their skin could tell their personal story and their experiences at the far ends of the world. It was a form of shared identity in the lonely vastness of the ocean. In bustling port towns like New York, London, and Lisbon, the first rudimentary tattoo studios began to appear. Small rooms filled with tobacco smoke, with jars of homemade ink, and fascinating stories of distant lands. These were not the sacred artists of Polynesian temples. They were often ex-sailors themselves, using makeshift needles and gunpowder soot as pigment. But for the men who daily faced the danger of drowning, tropical diseases, and the constant threat of mutinies on board, a little pain in exchange for a permanent souvenir did not seem too high a price to pay. Tattoos transformed into tangible memories, into silent confessions engraved on the skin, into personal maps of the places they had been, and the parts of themselves they could not leave behind in each port. In an era when most people's stories faded with time, sailors wrote theirs in indelible ink and let the sea carry them into legend. At the end of the 19th century, the tattoo had ceased to be exclusively the mark of the sailor or the social outcast. Thanks to a literal spark, that of electricity, tattoos were entering the modern world with full force. In 1891, Samuel O'Reilly, a visionary tattoo artist from New York City, patented the first functional electric tattoo machine. Inspired by the innovative electric pen invented by Thomas Edison, O'Reilly's device allowed for much faster and more precise tattooing, with a considerable reduction in bleeding. Suddenly, elaborate designs could be completed in a matter of hours, instead of strenuous days. Pain was still an inherent part of the process, but now the experience felt less like invasive surgery and more like a form of artistic expression. And with this revolutionary invention came a new era for the tattoo as a public spectacle. Traveling circuses and popular dime museums began to exhibit heavily tattooed men and women as exotic curiosities to the astonishment of the public. There was Captain George Constantinus, the supposed Greek prince whose entire body was covered in intricate oriental designs, and Nora Hildebrandt, one of the first tattooed ladies of the United States, whose impressive collection of ink was matched only by the dramatic and probably invented story of her captivity and forced tattooing by a savage tribe. These performers were not just sideshow oddities. They were living exhibits, their bodies transformed into walking narratives, attracting eager crowds and challenging strict Victorian notions of decency, especially when a woman dared to lift her sleeves and reveal a sinuous snake coiled around her shoulder. However, despite its growing popularity in certain circles, tattooing was still considered a taboo among the respectable society of the time. If one wore ink on their skin, it was assumed to mean something specific, having participated in war, having sailed the oceans, having spent time in prison, or having run away to join a traveling circus. And yet, behind closed doors, and in the privacy of their opulent homes, even the social elite began to get discreetly tattooed. It is rumoured that both King Edward VII of England and his son, the future King George V, had tattoos, one with a Jerusalem cross engraved as a memento of his pilgrimage, the other with an elaborate dragon inked during a visit to Japan. Aristocrats throughout Europe and even some prominent figures of American high society began to explore the novelty of body art, always with discretion in the intimacy of their residences, and of course, with plausible deniability in case they were discovered. Tattoo studios flourished in busy port cities, but soon they began to appear in urban centres as well. Small shops, often hidden between traditional barber shops and billiard halls where the clash of balls echoed. And while most artists were still men, a new generation of women began to wield the needle with skill, leaving their mark on the craft. The ink was spreading through society, ceasing to be solely a symbol of youthful or marginal rebellion, to become a powerful medium for capturing the memory of a loved one, affirming one's own identity, or simply celebrating the thrill of carrying something intrinsically personal, a mark that no one could take away. As the 20th century rushed forward, marked by the construction of towering skyscrapers, the roar of social revolutions, and the devastation of world wars, the art of tattooing continued its silent but constant evolution, though not always in the public light. Behind the imposing walls of prisons, in gloomy cells and desolate concrete yards, a new language of ink was being written, not on paper, but directly on the skin of inmates. These were not the polished tattoos of professional studios. They were raw, handcrafted creations, born of necessity and ingenuity, made with smuggled needles, frayed guitar strings, melted plastic, and an improvised ink made of soot and toothpaste. Painful, undoubtedly, precise in their detail, rarely, significant, always. In prisons scattered across the globe, from the icy Russian gulags to the harsh American penitentiaries, tattoos stood as a secret code, a system of visual communication understandable only to those immersed in its particular subculture. Each engraved image told a story. Each location on the body held a specific weight. A spider web tattooed on the elbow signified time served behind bars. A teardrop near the eye could indicate the loss of a dear life, or more somberly, a life taken. 5 dots tattooed on the hand, 4 in the corners and 1 in the center, conveyed the chilling message, "I am surrounded." In the brutal Soviet prisons, tattooing became a detailed and complex system of status and survival within the prison hierarchy. An elaborately tattooed cathedral on the chest could indicate years of incarceration, each dome representing a completed sentence. Stars tattooed on the shoulders marked a high-ranking prisoner who was not to be disrespected under any circumstances. But to fake this rank through ink could have fatal consequences. These tattoos were not mere bodily adornments. They were a form of psychological armor, a prison resume, a silent warning to other inmates, a prayer etched into the skin. In the prisons of the United States, tattoos took on a similar symbolic weight. Rival gang affiliations, demarcations of racial lines, claims of territory within the walls, and the deep pain of personal losses. The makeshift tattoo machine was often a shared tool among prisoners, and the ink passed from hand to hand as a form of clandestine communion. For many inmates, their first tattoo was not a free choice, but a forced rite of passage into acceptance within their new and hostile environment. But even outside the imposing prison walls, these tattoo styles born in darkness began to slowly filter into the outside world. Tattoo artists, especially those working in marginal urban areas, began to incorporate the bold, stark lines of prison art into their own work. What had begun as a form of survival behind bars gradually transformed into an artistic style, replicated in professional studios, immortalized in films, and reflected in street culture. Still, the social stigma associated with tattoos stubbornly persisted. A visible tattoo, especially one located on the hands, neck, or face, often meant closed doors in the professional world, preconceived judgments, and unfounded suspicions. The ink on the skin could fade over time, but the assumptions and social prejudices remained engraved in the minds of many. However, for those who bore these marks on their skin, they were not a source of shame but silent stories of survival in hostile environments, of time endured with stoicism, of an identity silently etched when the outside world refused to listen. Because sometimes, when no one pays attention to words, the skin becomes an eloquent narrator. At the dawn of the 21st century, the art of tattooing had undergone its most radical and democratizing transformation yet. From an ancient ancestral rite to a clandestine code of outlaws, to something completely different, a personal canvas for the expression of the individual self. What was once carefully hidden under clothing sleeves or cautiously mentioned in legal judgments was now proudly displayed on fashion runways, in corporate boardrooms, and in the omnipresent showcase of social media. From baristas to CEOs, from kindergarten teachers to war veterans, ink on the skin was no longer predominantly a symbol of youthful rebellion or social marginality. It had become a personal statement of identity, a visible form of self-expression. The rise of professional tattoo studios reflected this profound cultural shift. They were no longer dark, sordid shops with flickering neon signs. Many transformed into true sanctuaries of artistic expression, clean, carefully designed, and often with an aesthetic closer to a contemporary art gallery than the gritty dens of yesteryear. Tattoo artists became celebrities in their own right, with extensive digital portfolios, long waiting lists, and fervent admirers who travelled across continents just for the privilege of sitting in their chair. Tattoo styles experienced an explosion of creativity and diversity. Delicate watercolour tattoos with their vibrant splashes of colour, the elegant minimalism of fine lines, the photographic hyperrealism that challenged the distinction between skin and image. Sacred geometry with its cosmic patterns, the revival of ancestral cultural styles, detailed portraits of pets, loved ones, and even complete life narratives that stretched along the spine. Technology also played a crucial role in this transformation. Tattoo machines became quieter and more precise, needles finer and less invasive, inks safer, and the healing of tattooed skin faster and more efficient. But beneath this new, technologically advanced aesthetic, the ancestral motivations for getting tattooed remained surprisingly consistent. People still flocked to studios for the same fundamental reasons they always had: to commemorate a cherished memory, to express grief for an irreparable loss, to reclaim a sense of personal power, to celebrate a vital rebirth. Some tattoos marked important life milestones, like the birth of a child, the death of a loved one, or the beginning of a new chapter. Others covered scars, both those visible on the skin and those hidden in the soul. Some people got tattooed after escaping abusive relationships, engraving their resilience on their body. Some honored their ancestors, keeping their memory alive through ancestral symbols. Some wrote their story of survival in symbols they could not express with words. And yes, there were also those who simply felt a deep affinity for frogs in cowboy hats. there is also room for that joy and peculiarity in the vast universe of the tattoo. Around the world, indigenous tattoo practices began to resurface with pride and strength. The intricate Maori facial moko, the Inuit art of skin stitching, the ancestral Filipino batok, forms of body art that were once a source of shame or even banned by colonial forces, were being revitalized by new generations, reconnecting ancestral lineages through the meticulous work of lines and symbols. However, important debates persist about cultural appropriation, about the potential over-commercialization of sacred practices, about whether something intrinsically spiritual can survive intact when it becomes a mass consumer trend. But perhaps that is the inherent beauty of it all. Tattoos have always existed in a dynamic tension between physical pain and personal pride, between the permanence of ink and the inherently transient nature of life, between who we are at any given moment and who we aspire to be in the future. And so, inevitably, we return to the starting point. Ink pressed onto skin, a story told without the need for words, an indelible mark made not to seek external approval, but to express a deep and personal inner truth. And in the silent, ancestral language of the tattoo, that has always been intrinsically enough. Long before the towering pyramids of Giza cast their shadows over the desert sands, before the cities of Mesopotamia bustled with human activity, and before the mysterious monoliths of Stonehenge rose towards the sky, there was Caral, an ancestral secret hidden in the arid valleys of the Peruvian coast. Arising with a silent majesty almost 5 millennia ago, Caral flourished enigmatically before fading into almost complete darkness, swallowed by the sands of time and forgotten by history for centuries. The modern world did not even suspect its existence. At first glance, the Supe Valley, where Caral once thrived, seems an unlikely place for the birth of a civilization. The landscape is severe, barren, and the Supe River, the source of life, is nothing more than a thin silver thread winding precariously between rocks and dust. To most eyes, the valley seemed inhospitable, a place abandoned by fertility and the promise of life. Yet it was here, amidst this apparent desolation, that one of humanity's first great cities took shape, a testament to the resilience and ingenuity of the human spirit. Caral was not simply a scattering of precarious huts or an ephemeral trading post. It was a meticulously planned city that stretched over more than 60 hectares, intricately organized with imposing truncated pyramids, ceremonial plazas, well-defined residential neighborhoods, and spaces dedicated to rituals and community gatherings. It possessed scale, a clear purpose, and a vision for the future. A complex society that flourished centuries before Egyptian builders began to stack the first stones of their own pyramidal wonders. The people of Caral achieved this monumental feat without the knowledge of the wheel, without a developed system of written language, and without the use of metal tools. They erected massive structures of stone and earth with nothing more than their collective ingenuity, sustained community effort, and the raw force of human will. However, for millennia, the existence of Caral remained veiled by a cloak of silence and oblivion. Even when some occasional travelers stumbled upon the strange, eroded mounds scattered across the valley, they mistook them for natural geological formations, mere hills sculpted by the relentless desert winds. No one imagined that beneath the sandy surface lay one of the oldest cities in the world, a metropolis that predated even those civilizations that history books had crowned as the first to flourish. It was not until the late 20th century that archaeologists, led by the visionary Ruth Shady Solis, unearthed the astonishing truth. What they found buried under the accumulated dust of time would rewrite the history of the Americas and force the academic world to reconsider previous conceptions about the very birth of civilization. Caral had emerged, flourished with surprising vitality, and fallen into almost absolute anonymity. Now, after millennia of silence imposed by oblivion, its ancestral stones speak again, whispering the legacy of a peaceful and intelligent people who built a world of complexity and wonder in a land where life itself seemed an improbability. And this monumental discovery was only the beginning of the fascinating story of Caral. At first glance, the Supe River Valley presents itself as an environment where life should wage a constant battle for its mere subsistence. Harsh winds sweep across endless expanses of sand and stone, raising ephemeral whirlwinds in their relentless dance. The sun beats down with merciless intensity, drying the earth into a cracked and brittle mosaic. Water is a scarce commodity, with the river winding like a thin thread, struggling to maintain its vital course through a seemingly inhospitable landscape. To the untrained eye, it is a barren wasteland, empty and forgotten by the tutelary deities of fertility. However, the people of Caral viewed this same landscape with a radically different perspective. They did not see a relentless desert to be feared and avoided, but a vast and silent canvas waiting to be moulded by their ingenuity. They recognized the Supe River, however modest it seemed compared to other river currents, as the vital torrent of possibility, the artery that could irrigate their dreams of a prosperous community. And so, with unwavering patience, remarkable inventiveness, and a steely determination, they transformed this apparently hostile place into a flourishing oasis of life and culture, defying the limitations imposed by the natural environment. Their first crucial victory was agriculture. They learned to understand and tame the rhythms of the river's seasonal floods, designing and building simple yet ingeniously effective irrigation systems that channeled water through the fertile alluvial plain of the valley floor. Where others saw only sand and dust, they cultivated the first green shoots of hope: soft cotton, nutritious beans, gourds of various shapes, sweet guava, and energetic sweet potatoes. Cotton, in particular, became an invaluable resource, spun into sturdy fishing nets and fine textiles, driving a flourishing trade with nearby coastal villages and creating economic and social ties that extended far beyond their desert home. But the cultivation of crops was only one facet of their mastery of the environment. The people of Caral intuitively understood that survival in a demanding desert required a delicate balance with the forces of nature. They worked in harmony with their environment, not in direct confrontation. They built their homes and ceremonial plazas with the available materials, stone and earth, carefully designing them to withstand both the scorching heat of the day and the rare but devastating torrential rains that occasionally swept the valley. They carefully studied the movements of the stars and the succession of the seasons, planning their plantings and harvests with the precision of accomplished astronomers. Trade became the vital veins and arteries of Caral's economy, facilitating the exchange of goods and knowledge. Dried and salted fish, valuable spun cotton, fresh fruits, and meticulously crafted artisanal products flowed along the coast, connecting Caral with other communities. In return, they received exotic and coveted products: colorful seashells from the Pacific Ocean, rare and semi-precious stones from the distant heights of the Andes, and innovative ideas from distant peoples. Far from being isolated in their desert valley, the inhabitants of Caral wove a complex network of interdependence with their neighbors. In a land where mere survival seemed an arduous undertaking, Caral prospered thanks to collective intelligence, constant innovation, and a strong sense of community. They did not conquer the desert with brute force, but partnered with it, learning its subtle rhythms, respecting its inherent power, and building a society that was not only functional and sustainable but extraordinarily advanced. Against all odds, Caral flourished as a beacon of civilization in a rugged landscape, and its ascent was just beginning. Rising from the arid desert like ancient petrified guardians, the imposing truncated pyramids of Caral radically challenge everything we thought we knew about the first civilizations that emerged on the American continent. These were not small, crude structures erected by primitive and inexperienced hands. They were masterpieces of monumental architecture, conceived and deliberately built by a people endowed with a clear vision, a sophisticated social organization, and a remarkable collective ambition. The centerpiece of this ancestral metropolis was the Pyramide Mayor, the largest and most impressive of all the monumental structures of Caral. It extended majestically for more than 137 meters in length at its base, and rose almost 18 meters above the sandy surface of the desert, an astonishing feat of engineering comparable to the first wonders of the ancient world. Built with a combination of carefully carved stone, sun-dried mud bricks, and sturdy woven reed bags filled with rocks, the pyramid was designed not only to withstand the harsh climatic conditions of the valley, but also the violent and occasional earthquakes that shook the region. And it has stood with stoic serenity, remaining in silent contemplation against the onslaught of wind and the erosion of time for almost 5 millennia, a mute testimony to the skill and determination of its builders. But the imposing structures of Caral were not mausoleums intended to house the remains of their rulers. Unlike the colossal funerary complexes that characterized ancient Egypt, the pyramids of Caral served a different purpose, intrinsically linked to the social and spiritual fabric of their civilization. They were vibrant centers of ceremony, manifestations of community power, and the beating heart of public life. Temples and meeting spaces crowned their flattened summits, accessible through wide and elegant staircases that invited ascent. Once, Bright bonfires burned on the top of these elevated platforms, and solemn rituals were celebrated under the immensity of the Peruvian sky, connecting the community with cosmic forces. At the foot of these monumental pyramids lay vast plazas, some sunken and perfectly circular in shape, inviting thousands of people to congregate for religious ceremonies that strengthened spiritual bonds, political meetings where crucial decisions were made, and vibrant community celebrations that reinforced social cohesion. The very design of Carol's urban landscape suggested a society that placed a primary value on community and order, a people deeply interconnected with each other and with their understanding of the surrounding cosmos. Around the main pyramids were scattered smaller residential complexes, likely the homes of the priestly elite, the administrators who managed the city, the skilled artisans who produced essential goods, and the diligent farmers who cultivated the land. The pyramids themselves seem to have been strategically placed, meticulously aligned with significant celestial events, sunrises at key points of the year, the solstices that marked the agricultural rhythm, and the predictable cycles of the stars that guided their worldview. For the people of Caral, architecture transcended mere practical functionality. It was a tangible expression of their spirituality, their mathematical understanding of the universe, and their deep cosmic connection. Walking today among the stones eroded by time and wind, it is almost inevitable to succumb to a strange sense of reverential awe. These imposing structures rose without the aid of sophisticated metal tools, without the invention of the wheel to facilitate the transport of heavy materials, and without the strength of domesticated beasts of burden. Yet they rose with remarkable symmetry, an impressive scale, and an astonishing precision in their construction. The grand pyramids of Caral were not erected for the vanity of a ruler or for the warlike purposes of conquest. They were built with the transcendent purpose of connecting the earth with the starry sky, the human community with the vast cosmos, the transience of existence with the promise of eternity. And even today, their eroded stones whisper through the sands of time, telling a fascinating story that stubbornly refuses to be forgotten. Among the silent ruins of Caral, something profoundly different is perceived, a distinctive feature that separates it from many other ancient civilizations that rose and fell in the crucible of history. No weapons of war have been found buried under its ancestral sands. There are no imposing defensive walls surrounding its ceremonial plazas, nor mass graves that hint at bloody conquests or violent internal power struggles. Unlike the kingdoms that rose and fell through war and domination, Caral was a society intrinsically built on the foundations of peace and cooperation. It is a surprising revelation that challenges conventional expectations about the rise of the first civilizations. Here flourished a society that invested its collective energy not in the creation of armies or the construction of military fortresses, but in the development of monumental architecture, the precise observation of the heavens, expression through music, and the promotion of a rich community life. Its plazas and pyramids were not monuments commemorating military victories over external enemies, but neuralgic centers of celebration, spiritual worship, and community life. This was a civilization that chose to gather rather than conquer, to negotiate rather than destroy. Trade acted as the vital torrent that fueled the success and prosperity of Caral. The valuable cotton grown along the fertile banks of the Supe River was skillfully spun into sturdy fishing nets, which were then exchanged with coastal communities for marine resources. In turn, Caral received dried fish, an essential source of protein for their diet, and exotic products from distant places. Colorful seashells from the Pacific Ocean, precious and semi-precious stones from the Andean highlands, and even rare tropical fruits grown in distant valleys. This extensive and sophisticated trade network united the entire region, connecting distant communities in a peaceful web of mutual benefit and understanding. And at the epicenter of this dynamic exchange network, Caral prospered not only as a flourishing economic center, but also as a cultural melting pot where ideas and innovations spread. Religious and ceremonial life played a fundamental role in maintaining social harmony and community cohesion in Caral. The city's vast public spaces and unique sunken plazas likely served as imposing stages for collective rituals that united the people under a shared system of spiritual beliefs and religious practices. Music filled these gatherings with melodies, resonating from flutes delicately carved from condor and pelican bones, and the constant rhythm of drums made from deerskin, creating evocative soundscapes that stretched across the desert, intertwining individual lives into something transcendent. Leadership in Caral seems to have depended less on military force and more on spiritual authority and efficient civic organization. The leaders must have coordinated massive construction projects that required meticulous planning, managed the seasonal agricultural cycles crucial for their sustenance, and handled complex trade agreements with other communities. All this without leaving the brutal scars of war and conquest. In an ancient world so often defined by violent conflict, Carol stands as a luminous exception, a silent reminder that civilization does not necessarily have to rise on the broken backs of the conquered, but can be built with the silent yet enduring power of collaboration, collective creativity, and mutual trust. In Caral, even today, the ancestral stones seem to vibrate with the echoes of a long-lost world. It was not simply a city of buildings and commercial exchange. It was a living city, imbued with sound, ceremony, and a deep spiritual rhythm. Music and ritual were intrinsically intertwined at the very heart of the Caral civilization. Archaeologists, carefully excavating through the dry sands that covered the ancestral city, discovered a treasure trove of ancient musical instruments. Delicate flutes crafted from the bones of majestic condors and coastal pelicans, finely carved whistles from deer antlers, and small drums stretched with animal hides. These artifacts were not simple toys or pastimes. They were painstakingly crafted, tuned to specific notes, and designed to project sound across the vast open plazas of the city. In a world where written language had not yet flourished, music spoke the language of the human soul directly, transcending the barriers of words. Imagine the scene, the deep rumble of drums rising with the arrival of dusk, the flutes wailing evocative melodies like the wind whispering through the desert, feet rhythmically stamping the surfaces of the sunken plazas as hundreds of people gathered under the fading sunlight. Bright bonfires would crackle atop the pyramid platforms, and priests, adorned in intricate, carefully woven garments, would chant to the deities of the river that provided them sustenance, to the earth that fed them, and to the stars that guided their worldview. In those transcendent moments, Caral was not simply a city of stone and mud. It was a living symphony of sounds, movements, and shared beliefs. The urban design of Caral itself suggests that ritual life occupied a central place in its existence. The large plazas were not mere open spaces for transit. They were carefully designed stages for communal ceremonies, conceived to gather the population around their shared beliefs. The unique sunken circular courtyards acted as ancient amphitheatres, focusing both sound and vision towards the rituals performed in their sacred centres. And rising above it all, the imposing pyramids stood not as silent tombs, but as sacred mountains, built by human hands, symbolically uniting the earth with the vast, starry heavens. The rituals likely marked the change of seasons that governed their agricultural cycle, the crucial moments of planting and harvesting that ensured their sustenance, and the predictable movements of the stars that influenced their worldview. Music was not simply a form of entertainment, it was an intangible bridge that connected people to each other, the community to the forces of nature, and the divine, the known to the mysteries that stretched beyond their immediate understanding. In Caral, surprisingly, no murals depicting violent scenes have been found, nor terrifying warrior deities, nor evidence of bloodthirsty sacrifices. The spiritual world of Caral seems to have been imbued with a profound harmony, a constant celebration of life, and a reverence for the forces that sustained it. Even today, as the desert wind whistles mournfully through the ancestral ruins, one can almost hear the faint echoes of an ancient music, the forgotten songs of a people who found beauty, transcendent meaning, and a deep community connection in the heart of an austere and unforgiving landscape. Caral was not only a center of music, dynamic trade, and community rituals, it was also an astonishing marvel of ancient engineering, an eloquent testament to human ingenuity flourishing in one of the most challenging landscapes on Earth. Without the use of sophisticated metal tools, without the knowledge of the wheel to facilitate the transport of heavy materials, and without the help of domesticated draft animals, the people of Caral molded an imposing city of stone and earth that has silently endured for almost 5 millennia. Their engineering achievements are simply astounding. Massive truncated pyramids rose from the desert floor, built not with small, fragile bricks, but with enormous blocks of stone, painstakingly transported across the arid valley. The workers mobilized these heavy rocks using ingenious woven reed bags, sturdy baskets capable of supporting considerable loads, made from the same plants that grew along the banks of the river that provided their sustenance. Layer by layer, they built with meticulous care, stacking stones and filling the interiors with rubble, to create monumental structures capable of withstanding not only the relentless passage of time, but also the occasional fury of nature. And they deeply understood the forces of nature. Carroll is located in a region prone to violent earthquakes, yet its pyramids and plazas have survived largely intact to this day. How did they achieve this remarkable feat of seismic resistance? By mastering the principles of flexible, earthquake-resistant architecture. The builders of Carroll employed innovative construction techniques, strategically placed layers of fill, wide support bases, and rounded corners that allowed their monuments to absorb and dissipate the energy released by earth tremors. It was sophisticated engineering born not from theoretical treatises, but from an intimate, practical knowledge of the land itself. Water management was another silent triumph of Carroll's engineering. Despite living in a desert environment with limited rainfall, the people of Carroll developed sophisticated irrigation systems, intricate canals that carefully guided the vital river water to their agricultural fields, allowing their crops to thrive even during the prolonged dry seasons. This precious resource was not allowed to be wasted. Every drop was valued and used efficiently. The urban design of Carroll itself reflected brilliant urban planning. The city's main structures were meticulously aligned with key astronomical points, suggesting a deep understanding of solar cycles and their importance for agriculture and ceremonial life. The unique sunken plazas, with their precise circular geometry, were more than just community gathering places. They were ancient astronomical instruments designed to track the movements of celestial bodies, allowing priests and astronomers to predict the seasons crucial for their survival. Even the spatial organization of the city spoke of a complex and well-structured society. Clearly defined residential zones, administrative areas dedicated to management, and sacred ceremonial centers were arranged in a harmonious relationship, balancing the needs of community life with the importance of sacred spaces. They built not just for immediate needs, but with a long-term vision for the future generations that would inhabit their city of stone and heart in the desert. Today, as contemporary engineers gaze in awe at the endurance of Carroll, they are reminded of a fundamental lesson. The greatness of a civilization is not measured solely by its technological sophistication. Sometimes, the deepest wisdom lies in the ability to understand the elemental forces of nature, to establish a symbiotic relationship with the land, working in harmony with it rather than trying to subjugate it. The ancestral stones of Carroll have stoically withstood the onslaught of countless storms, the fury of earthquakes, and the relentless erosion of time itself. They stand as a silent yet eloquent testament to a visionary civilization that shaped its dreams of greatness in the seemingly inhospitable sands of the coastal desert. For centuries, the city of Carroll flourished as a beacon of unusual peace, where music resonated in its plazas, trade invigorated its economy, and architectural mastery was manifested in its imposing pyramids, all nestled in a challenging desert environment. And then, silently, leaving almost no discernible trace, it was mysteriously abandoned. No devastating fire marked its fall. No sign of violent conquest scars its structures. No mass grave or shattered monument tells a story of sudden catastrophe. Instead, Carroll simply faded away gradually. Its vibrant plazas became deserted. Its majestic pyramids were left at the mercy of the relentless shifting sands, and its ancestral flutes and drums were silenced by the inexorable passage of time. Why did its inhabitants leave? This question still lingers, like a silent spectre haunting the arid Supe Valley. Some scholars suggest that a drastic environmental change dealt the final blow to its existence. Archaeological evidence hints that a prolonged period of severe drought may have paralyzed Carroll's agriculture, the basis of its sustenance. Without the life-giving waters of the Supe River, the painstakingly cultivated fields would have withered, and the intricate trade networks that depended on the surplus of cotton and food products would have irreparably weakened. The delicate balance that Carroll had maintained with its hostile environment may have finally tipped beyond the possibility of repair. Other intriguing theories point to the possible displacement of the trade routes that sustained Carroll's economy. As neighboring cultures grew in power and influence, and new centers of power emerged along the coast and in the interior, Carroll's dominant position as a key trade hub may have gradually diminished. Perhaps the goods they once supplied in abundance, high-quality cotton, nutritious dried fish, fresh agricultural products, were no longer sufficient to maintain their role as a principal city and regional exchange center. Slowly, the vital torrent of trade that had sustained it dried up, leading to its decline. Still other scholars whisper about the possibility of an internal decline, a social disintegration from within. Given the absence of written records, we can only speculate about possible internal political struggles, religious turmoil that divided the community, or simply a collective exhaustion after centuries of constant growth and the pressure of maintaining a complex society. Even seemingly peaceful societies can fracture under the pressure of scarcity and uncertainty about survival. Whatever the ultimate cause, the departure of Carroll's inhabitants seems to have been a gradual and silent process, not a sudden and chaotic evacuation. Families likely left one by one, seeking more fertile valleys to settle, more abundant rivers to guarantee their livelihood, new beginnings in unknown lands. The children who once ran through the vibrant plazas of Corral grew up telling stories of a city lost in the distance, a memory that would eventually fade into the realm of legend. The relentless desert reclaimed what human tenacity had built with such effort. Winds laden with fine sand slowly covered the stone temples, and the ancestral flutes and drums were buried under the shifting dunes. What had once been a bustling and vibrant civilization transformed into a field of silent, sleeping mounds, waiting to be rediscovered. For almost 4 millennia, Corral remained hidden under a sandy shroud of silence, a barely audible whisper beneath the surface of time. Today, as archaeologists carefully unearth its ancestral stones, the fundamental question still persists with palpable intensity. How does a city so advanced for its time, so beautifully built, and apparently prosperous simply disappear? Perhaps the truth is that even the grandest civilizations, no matter how wise or peaceful they are in their essence, remain fragile and delicate, threads woven into the vast tapestry of time, always vulnerable to the invisible and often unpredictable forces of change. For millennia, Carroll remained forgotten, buried under the silent sands of the Supe Valley. Occasional travelers passed by the strange rounded hills that dotted the arid landscape, never suspecting that beneath their feet lay the ruins of a civilization much older than the pyramids of Egypt themselves, a chronological landmark that challenged the conventional understanding of history. To them, these sandy elevations were simply natural formations, mounds sculpted by the patient action of wind and the erosion of time. It was not until the late 20th century that the world would finally hear Carroll's silent voice again. In the 1990 seconds, Peruvian archaeologist Ruth Shady Solis led a team of researchers into the Supe Valley, driven by a deep curiosity and a growing intuition that these peculiar hills might hold ancestral secrets that no one had yet managed to unearth. What they found, after years of meticulous excavation, would rewrite the history of human civilization in the Americas. Layer by layer, with infinite patience, the sand accumulated over millennia was removed. Beneath emerged carefully carved stone walls, wide staircases ascending to the sky, sunken plazas that once resonated with activity, and the imposing truncated pyramids, revealing a city far older and more complex than anyone could have imagined. Radiocarbon dating confirmed the incredible. Corral was over 4,600 years old, thriving simultaneously with the first civilizations that emerged in Mesopotamia and the Nile Valley. It was a transcendental discovery that shook the foundations of world archaeology. Before the discovery of Corral, the prevailing opinion among scholars was that civilization in the Americas had developed much later, overshadowed in antiquity and complexity by the great empires of the Old World. Carroll radically changed this perspective. It demonstrated irrefutably that the Americas had given birth to monumental architecture, a complex urban life, and a sophisticated social organization independently, long before the rise of later empires like the Incas or the Maya civilization. Ruth Shady and her team did not just find stone and rubble. They unearthed the tangible vestiges of a vibrant daily life, delicate musical instruments that once filled the air with ancestral melodies, sturdy fishing nets that sustained their community, intricate textiles that revealed their artisanal skill, enigmatic quipus, ancient knot-based recording systems that held crucial information, and even ritual offerings, carefully deposited to honor their deities. Each meticulously recovered artifact told the story of a people who had built a society with foresight, sharp intelligence, and profound creativity. The rediscovery of Carral was much more than a simple academic triumph. It was a true resurrection of a forgotten past. A civilization that had slept peacefully under the desert sands for millennia was now revealed under the open sky once more, its ancestral plazas kissed by the same winds that once carried the sounds of melancholic flutes and the carefree laughter of children. Today, Carroll is recognized as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, a fragile and invaluable link to humanity's earliest dreams of building, belonging to a community, and transcending through their beliefs. The desert sands had hidden Carroll well for countless centuries, but in the end, the ancestral stones endured, waiting patiently for someone to hear their silent story, see their forgotten greatness, and remember their legacy. Carroll stands today as a silent giant, an imposing reminder that the roots of human civilization extend much deeper into time than we once believed. Among its imposing pyramids and its vast ceremonial plazas, the ancient stones whisper a transcendental story that reshapes our understanding of humanity's journey. A story that does not focus on conquest and bloodshed, but on harmony with nature, collective ingenuity, and a tenacious hope for the future. Long before the imposing empires of Greece, Rome, or even ancient Egypt arose, the people of Carroll were building something extraordinary in a remote corner of the world. They raised pyramids without the knowledge of the wheel, charted the movements of the stars without sophisticated written records, and created a prosperous society rooted in peaceful trade, expression through music, the deep spirituality of ritual, and a remarkable mastery of engineering. All this without leaving scars of war on the land that sustained it. In an era of ancient history, often defined by conflict and domination, Carroll offers an alternative and luminous vision of what civilization can become. A society that valued community connection over territorial conquest, shared knowledge over imposition by force. It reminds us that social complexity does not inherently require violence, that the true greatness of a civilization is not measured by the number of armies that march on a battlefield, but by a community's ability to unite with a common purpose, to build, create, and dream of a better future. The enduring legacy of Carroll extends far beyond the arid sands of the Supe Valley. It challenges the old Eurocentric assumptions that civilization had a single cradle in the old world, that complex urban life and monumental architecture belonged exclusively to that narrative. Carroll demonstrates irrefutably that the human spirit of innovation and the aspiration to achieve greatness arose independently in many diverse corners of the earth, shaped by different hands and unique environments, but driven by the same eternal desires to endure through time, to celebrate life in community, and to achieve a meaningful connection with the divine. Today, walking among the eroded ruins of Carroll, one can almost conjure in imagination the rhythmic pulse of ancestral drums, the melancholic murmur of bone flutes, the bustle of merchants bargaining in the dusty plazas, the carefree laughter of children running through the narrow stone alleys under a sky studded with infinite stars. Their lives, their dreams, their stories still resonate in the silence of the desert, indelibly engraved on the bones of the earth. Carroll teaches us a timeless lesson, that even when civilizations seemingly disappear, their spirit can endure, sleeping patiently under the sands of oblivion, waiting to be remembered and to have the capacity to inspire new generations. In the vast timeline of human history, Carroll shines not only as a fascinating relic of the distant past, but as a beacon of hope for the future. A reminder that even in the most hostile deserts and under the heaviest sands, the seeds of wonder, ancestral wisdom, and lasting peace can take deep root and build a world that reaches for the stars. And so, as the sun sets behind the silent dunes of the Supe Valley, leaving a trail of warm colors in the sky, the story of Carroll gently fades into the night. We have journeyed through millennia, from the echo of ancestral flutes to the silence of its deserted plazas, from the majesty of its pyramids to the mystery of its departure. Carroll reminds us that greatness does not always leave a trail of conquest and violence, but that sometimes it flourishes in harmony, creativity, and a deep connection with the land. Its legacy, though hidden for centuries, speaks to us today with an ancient but surprisingly relevant voice, whispering about the human capacity to build wonders, to thrive in adversity, and to find peace in community. May the silence of Carroll now envelop you in a deep calm, as the memory of a forgotten civilization gently fades into sleep. Good night.